Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm going to be doing a video that I've been wanting to do for quite a while now, and that is doing my season rankings for Power Rangers, where Power Rangers is a show that I do have a lot of nostalgia for. It was essentially my favorite show as a kid, starting by watching reruns of Power Rangers Lost Galaxy and keeping up with the show until all the way through Mystic Force, only to come back around the time of Megaforce and finding a newfound appreciation for the show, only to then drop it off again until very recently, largely in preparation for this video. And this is one of these sort of videos that I've been wanting to make ever since I started the channel. And now with it being the 30th anniversary of Power Rangers, the 30th season of the show just recently aired in Cosmic Fury. And we're also at this point where Power Rangers is probably going on a bit of a hiatus for a little bit here. It just makes all the sense in the world for me to finally get around to doing this video here. So, and here we'll be ranking the 30 seasons of Power Rangers, which again, this will be more of a season ranking, not a series ranking, as each individual season of all these shows will be separated. So again, all the Neo Saban era that did have multiple seasons, they'll be separated into their individual seasons. The likes of MMPR, that's going to be separated into 3 seasons. However, when it comes to Alien Rangers, I did end up putting it in part of season 3, as it technically is, even though it is also kind of its own miniseries. It's kind of weird, but again, I include it as season 3 for the sake of this list. So again, we got 30 seasons to rank here. Let's start it off at number 30. The worst season of Power Rangers in my mind is Power Rangers Megaforce. And Megaforce is just a largely soulless season. I mean, it's a season that I think coming back with the Neo Saban era after having obviously been canceled after RPM, it really feels like Saban just made the show without any real care to it at all. It seemed like they simply were just taking the Sentai footage and really just utilizing the Sentai footage as much as possible. With Megaforce in particular being a situation where it doesn't even feel like they bothered to actually have a true story to the season. It just feels like characters are there for the sake of setting up these action sequences that are really the bulk of these episodes, which again, I think is a shame. I think there's an interesting concept to be had here, especially considering the overall concept of Megaforce and Super Megaforce kind of harkens back to what happened with the original seasons, where they would change Sentai sources, they'll use the same cast. I feel like there's like really interesting stuff they could have used here, and instead they did it in the most half-assing way. And again, Megaforce in particular here for me is just, again, a season that has no substance to it. No characters really given any development. It's just all action, action, action. And while there are characters that I wish I could like the likes of Gia and even Robo Knight is fine, there's simply no substance this season. So again, for me, it's at the bottom here, number 30. Number 29, we have a season that I do struggle with my thoughts on this season. It's obviously a season that a new field of Power Ranger fans obviously have a lot of nostalgia for. However, I hated it at the time, and I'm still going to rank it low. At 29, I do have Power Ranger Samurai. And Samurai is just a step above Megaforce for me in the sense that it at least has a story. It's a terrible story, and it's a story that plot-wise, it's essentially just copying directly from Shinkenger, because again, that's literally what happened with Samurai. Again, it was rushed together. They literally just took scripts from Shinkenger and just translated them into English and thought that was good enough. And really, again, like most of the Power Rangers Samurai and Super Samurai are just essentially direct copies of the original Sentai. The problem is that it's a Sentai that's directly based within Japanese culture. And like for us to be believing that all these people have Japanese heritage and are part of the samurai lineage is just really stupid. And the writing is abysmal. The acting is terrible. Like, I think Samurai is a truly terrible season. I don't really feel like there's really anything good about the season. Even the Decker storyline, which is probably the most notable aspect of the season, it's simply just mediocre. I feel like most of the characters come off as pretty unlikable, especially when Antonio comes to the picture, and for some reason they just shun him because he's not a real samurai, because he doesn't have samurai in his lineage, which is like stupid. So this season sucks. I mean, it's a bad season. The only reason it's above Megaforce is because at least it does have a story to it. At least it kind of it doesn't try, but like you can say it tries because it at least has a story. So again, like that's really it. So because that for me, it's here number 29. Number 28, I mean, a season that I actually used to rank higher. However, under further inspection, this is such a disappointing season. At 28, I'm putting Super Megaforce. And Super Megaforce obviously is a massive disappointment. It's a season that was hyped up as this 20th anniversary season, even though it was the 21st season. And it just really underwhelmed. Sure, I do have a level of nostalgia for this season in the fact that this is what got me back into Power Rangers for a while. The announcement of Super Megaforce and all the speculation of who's getting brought back for the season. Like, I remember being really excited for this coming out, and then it just all underwhelmed me. Again, it essentially is just Megaforce, but with references to older seasons, which as a whole is done terribly, as there's no real substance to a lot of these references. They're simply there because either Gokaiger had them or they did the most minimal work as possible to try to make an actual reference. And the legendary battle ends up obviously being very disappointing, where a lot of the returning members aren't given anything to do. It's simply just cameos. You also have the laziness of them not even cutting out the older Sentai teams and just giving them random names that just excuse themselves for just being so lazy and using just the Sentai footage, even though there are situations where they went out of their way to edit out some of the Sentai teams. So it's just really inconsistent in that light. Now I'll say there's probably like one good cameo in all this, the Casey cameo episode, which I thought that was actually like a good episode for whatever it's worth. But as a whole, again, this season is just severely lackluster. Again, it feels like, again, more Megaforce of no substance to story, simply most of the episodes being excuses to have action sequences in there. With those action sequences, again, having references to previous seasons, but having references more so because just the Sentai footage had those references and they decide, screw it, we'll do the same. You know, some of these references don't even make sense. Again, we got them going to Corinth, which looks nothing like Corinth because, again, they literally just took footage from the Sentai where Corinth didn't exist. So again, Super Megaforce sucks. I at one point had it higher simply because I did have like nostalgia for a season, and some of the references can be okay, but again, at the end of the day, it is still disappointing season through and through, and because of that, for me, it's here at 28. On 27, we have a season that I also still don't like, but I feel like it's at least a little bit more consistent throughout, and that season is Power Rangers Super Ninja Steel. The second season of Ninja Steel, which is just there. It exists. It's Or, I mean, really, that's just the thing with Ninja Steel, is that a lot of it's just extremely baseline. It's pretty much as average a Power Rangers as you can expect it to be without anything to really prop it up really at all. Like, I don't feel like Super Ninja Steel really has much substance to it. I feel like it's a season that largely didn't need to exist. I feel like Ninja Steel's story kind of wraps up in its first season, where season 2 just feels like them elongating it just for the sake of having a second season. It doesn't feel like anything really happens in this season, outside of the fact that we obviously get the tribute episode, Dimensions in Danger, which is kind of a lackluster one, largely because of how rushed it was, to where while I think there's good ideas in it, it simply just doesn't execute particularly well. And again, I find most of the cast of this season kind of mundane. A lot of them don't get that much to really do on this season. And overall, again, it's just a fine season through and through. Like, it's a watchable season outside the fart humor, which, again, that's really bad. But, again, it's a fine, watchable season, but one that really doesn't have any high points to it. One that doesn't really feel like it has a purpose to it. It doesn't feel like it's doing anything in its run here, which is why, for me, Super Ninja Steel is at 27. Now 26. Who would have guessed? I have Ninja Steel. And, again, Ninja Steel for me is a step above it in the fact that there's at least a story that wraps up in the finale. Again, at least that's there. I think there's this interesting setup, this interesting mystery to what happened to Brody's family, and obviously eventually that gets solved. And overall, the story of the season is just kind of okay. But outside of that, again, it's the same as Super Ninja Steel. I think these two are very similar. Just the fact that there's at least a more interesting story going on in the first season is really the reason why it's higher here. I mean, outside that, again, it's still a pretty mundane cast. A cast that doesn't really feel like they have much development. I feels like Sarah is probably the only character that I think develops really at all throughout the season. And while I think the characters of Calvin and Haley have an interesting dynamic, or at least could have, they really don't do much with them. Brody's a pretty boring Red Ranger. Preston's fine, he's there. So I mean, like it's just a very blah season as a whole, but at least one that's a bit more consistent, one that at least has a storyline. So again, that's why I have it a spot higher at 26. And 25, we have a season that I think is probably worse than the two Ninja Steels. Technically, I think this is a season that is very rocky. However, I think there's one major storyline from this season that does prop it up a bit for me, and that is Power Rangers Super Samurai, where straight away you can't tell through the first 6 spots on this list. We've gone through the entirety of Samurai Megaforce and Ninja Steel, but again, I think Super Samurai is the best of these seasons, simply because I think it has probably the best individual storyline within all of them. It has the Lauren storyline, which really I think makes the back 5 episodes or so of the season pretty solid. Now, I will say I do think the Rangers kind of mistreat her, which is not particularly great, but still, in terms of notable storylines for really all the seasons up to this point, I think this is probably the most notable of the bunch for me, where it just feels like a massive standout amongst the Neo Saban era, which is filled with, again, mostly bad acting and mundane storylines. But again, I feel like the Lauren storyline, again, while it's essentially just copied from the Sentai, I think it is still interesting, and it does have good acting from Kimberly Crossman, so at least that's something. Beyond that, again, it's kind of just more of the same. It's kind of just more of Samurai. Bad writing, copying ripping it directly from Sentai. The filler's probably not as egregious, so I mean, at least that's something. But I do like the final battle of the season, even though, again, it's essentially just straight up action scene after action scene after action scene. I do like the way that Master Xandred's taken out, or I think it's probably the most satisfying final battle of the seasons we've talked about so far. So again, at least there's that as well. Again, I think there's like minor positives to Super Samurai. So while it's mostly still bad, it's still enough to land it here at number 25. Now number 24, and if you told me that this season would be this high on the list when I originally watched it, I would be mind blown. This somehow not being at the very bottom. And at number 24, I do have Operation Overdrive, which I think is a bad season. It's really bad. And I think really on paper, I think it's probably a worse season than some of the ones we talked about. However, again, for me, it's like at least they tried. At least they tried something new. They tried to do this adventure-focused season where they're traveling the world and finding these artifacts. And again, I think it's at least a good concept. Obviously, the execution is bad. I think most of the characters come off as pretty unlikable. I feel like the main interesting storyline of the season comes from Mac's storyline, which while executed pretty well in like the back half of the season, I don't feel like it's enough to really salvage the season. Also, the acting throughout the season is kind of a bit rough. I mean, obviously people hate Dax as a character, which I could fully get, though. I did find him kind of humorous at points, at least when I originally watched it. I do think the villains are really shallow, which I think is a shame. And again, like I understand the criticisms for the season. I think it is pretty bad as a whole. But for me, it's again, I think at least they tried. And at least I do have like a level of reverence for it in the fact that I at least watched it when I was a bit younger. Unlike nowadays, where I think that is a major thing with modern Power Ranger seasons, is again, watching these newer seasons when you're in your late 20s feels particularly rough, especially when it's bad. And I feel like Operation Overdrive, which again, I didn't watch until years after it originally aired, but I was still a teenager at that point. I was at least a little bit closer to the target demographic, but really just as a whole, Operation Overdrive is simply just not that good though. It's simply a season that I think had a lot of potential. I think there are a lot of good concepts with the show, but I think as a whole, it just ends up being kind of wasted with a pretty unlikable cast and just some terrible writing throughout. For a while, people might point out that Once a Ranger is a good episode from this season. I actually disagree, and I think it's pretty bad, but that'll be for another potential video down the road. But either way, I don't think Operation Overdrive is that good, so it's here at 24. Now 23, we're moving back to the newer seasons with a couple more that I think are fine, but they didn't really do too much for me. At 23, we do have Power Rangers Dino Supercharge, which I really hate this title. Obviously, just adding super to the beginning of every second season is dumb, but to have it in the middle is even more bothersome. But either way, Dino Supercharge is a disappointing season for me. And the fact that I liked Dino Charge, which again, we'll talk about that later on the list. I thought Dino Charge was actually a good season from the Neo Saban era, which was shocking. The problem for me is that Dino Supercharge just feels like they took a lot of the momentum from Dino Charge and just kind of threw it away, where the season kind of goes off the rails, ends up getting a lot of filler, ends up losing a lot of its luster, where I feel like there were a lot of like interesting mysteries being set up through season one, and kind of those are wrapped up relatively early on. The season just kind of meanders afterwards. Now again, it's not entirely bad. I do still really like the cast. I think the cast of Dino Charge is one of the better, newer casts. I do still think it's a step up from a lot of the other Neo Saban seasons, but it's still not great in the grand scheme of things. And particularly the finale, I think, is pretty bad, where we get this like ridiculous outcome to the season that was just so funny when watching it. I remember that really soured me on this season as well. So again, I think as a whole, like I do look at this as a fine season. Again, considering it's a Neo Saban season, I think it definitely is one of the better ones, even though again it's still very flawed, and again, it's still very low on the list here. So I don't think it's actually that good, but I think it's still enough good in it, really with its cast. And again, the villain and Heckle, who I think is pretty decent as well. So again, because of that, for me, it's here at number 23. Now, number 22, we're keeping with more recent seasons of the show, actually getting to our first Hasbro season, and really only one we're going to be talking about for a little while, and that is Dino Fury Season 1, which might be an unpopular opinion here. I mean, I know a lot of people really liked Dino Fury when it first aired, though I think it would be pretty undeniable to say that Season 1 is definitely worse than Season 2. However, again, like it seemed like a lot of people like Season 1 to where they would rank it higher than this. I didn't. I was actually really underwhelmed when watching Dino Fury because I knew how hyped it was in the fan base, and I just found Season 1 really lackluster. I think it's a season that, again, kind of feels in line with something like Dino Charge, where there's good ideas at points. The cast, for the most part, is fine, but I feel like it doesn't do anything with it. I think instead it just gives us a bevy of filler with very little narrative progression, with most of that narrative progression coming in season 2. So where, again, I just felt like Dino Fury just felt like a season that was kind of just meandering about. Obviously needed to set up the characters and all that stuff, but even then I didn't find them to be that interesting in the grand scheme of things. Really, for me, it's like when I think of Dino Fury, a lot of what I remember it for really just stems from season 2 instead of season 1, where really I feel like outside of like the premiere, which was good, and then a couple episodes in the middle, every other episode just kind of screams out as just okay. Even the finale of the season is just kind of okay. And again, like, I really did not find myself loving Dino Fury until a bit later on in the series, which is why for me I do struggle placing this too high. Even though, again, I do think it is better than most in the Saban seasons, it simply didn't interest me nearly as much as many of the other Hasbro seasons. So because of that, for me, it's here number 22. Now, 21, we're finally not going to a modern Power Ranger season. We're actually going to a very old school Power Ranger season. And at number 21, we do have Mighty Morphin Power Rangers Season 2, which might be an unpopular opinion here. I know obviously there are a lot of people that love Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, and there's a lot of people that love Season 2. I am not one of those people. I've always been one of these people that never liked Season 2. I think Season 2 is filled with a lot of filler. Majority of the season is filler, where there's really no narrative progression through a lot of the season. And really, obviously, the main episodes of the season are the Mutiny, where obviously Lord Zed comes into the picture. You got White Light, where Tommy comes in as the White Ranger. You got the Power Transfer, where the really terrible storyline of introducing Rocky, Adam, and Aisha because they wouldn't pay Jack, Zach, and Trini's actors more comes into play, which overall, the overall handling of that is definitely a major negative of this season, where, again, very clearly they just dub over the other characters until they're able to swap them out. And even when they swap them out, again, it makes no sense that they're going to a peace conference. Now that we have the wedding between Zed and Rita, which is something, but again, like, really just a lot of this season just feels like them meandering about. It feels like there's nothing truly happening here. And to be fair, that's a lot of Mighty Morphin Power Rangers until a certain other season, where it just feels like things are happening for the sake of getting to these fights with the Sentai monsters. And again, I think it does a much better job at it than something like Megaforce. There's obviously more time being spent with these characters outside of the fights, and you also get more unmorph fights, and again, like, there is more there for sure, but not that much more there. And again, I do feel like season 2 here is a season that doesn't really have that much substance to it, with most of the season just coming off as filler with not much narrative progression. And while, again, like, White Light in particular is an all-time great episode for me, to me it is not enough to really rate this much higher than number 21 here. Now, number 20, who would have guessed? I have another Mighty Morphin Power Ranger season. Here I have season 1. And again, obviously this might be controversial. Obviously a lot of people like season 1, but I mean, I think this is a pretty mediocre season of Power Rangers. And I already talked about in detail in my retrospective, but it's another season where, again, there's not much serialization here. It's simply just filler episode after filler episode for most of its run. Again, we do get obviously a solid intro in Day of the Dumpster, and we obviously get Green with Evil, and then Doomsday is pretty solid as well. I mean, outside of that, it's just mostly filler episodes of Rita sending down monsters. The Rangers obviously just taking down the monster today, while also having some sort of high school or youth center related thing for them to have as their secondary plot, but really just no, again, true character development. I mean, all the characters come off as very shallow on this season. Not much really even happens with the characters on this season. And while, again, there are some good episodes within that for sure, like the Green Candle, you obviously, again, have Green with Evil, you have Doomsday, you have these solid episodes. They're simply just far and few between. And again, just as a whole, I do feel like the season is just very lacking in substance, which is why for me I do have it here number 20. Now number 19, and now we're moving on to a season that I've never liked. It's a season that actually got me out of Power Rangers. As I mentioned earlier, at 19, I do have Mystic Force. And I mean, there certainly are good things about Mystic Force. Again, now rewatching it when I'm older, I do feel like there are things that I definitely respect a lot more from it than when I originally watched it. However, my biggest issue with Mystic Force is the Red Ranger and Nick. I think Nick is a terrible character, and I do want to do a Red Ranger ranking at some point, and maybe I'll talk about it more there, but I think Nick is a character that, despite the entire season being solely based around him, they simply make no real effort to make him likable in the slightest. They actually feel like they go out of their way to make him not particularly likable, making him come off as a selfish prick throughout a lot of the season, and for us to have the start to care about his backstory and thinking of him as the hero that's going to save the day is just kind of of ridiculous to me. And it obviously comes at the wayside of every other character. I don't think any other Ranger outside maybe Xander gets really any true depth to them. Now, again, you get some pretty good storylines, like Korag's storyline for the most part is solid. You do have the Dark Wish 3-parter, which is actually a pretty strong one. Heir Apparent is also pretty good. But again, just as a whole, I do feel like the season is largely lacking. I think its villains outside of Korag are particularly weak. I think the main characters are particularly weak. And outside those like very minor glimpses of decent episodes, and the fact that I do think it is obviously a unique premise to the season, kind of mixing in Power Rangers with Harry Potter, but probably even more so like something like Lord of the Rings, is again a pretty interesting aesthetic to the season. So again, at least there's that. But I think as a whole, I still don't love this season. It definitely is on the lower side of things for me, even though it's not entirely bad, which is why it's above a lot of seasons we've talked about so far. But again, I can't move it much higher here than number 19. Now, number 18, we're moving on to a season that I've actually never loved. I mean, while this is a season that I remember watching a lot as I was a kid, I never particularly liked it that much. And kind of in line with the other two older school seasons we talked about, at number 18, I do have Power Rangers Zeo. Zeo, for me, is just kind of a fine series. It's a series that it feels like a decent progression of seasons 1 and 2 of Mighty Morphin. It is better than those seasons in my mind. Again, it is essentially just more of the same of those seasons, but again, with a bit more depth. We obviously know the characters a bit more. There are certain episodes that are pretty strong, like King for a Day. We have Ranger of Two Worlds. We have some notable storylines here. We get the return of Jason. But the problem for me is that a lot of those episodes come in like the back third of the season, to where I feel like the first 2/3 of the season is just kind of lackluster. And it feels like a regression of Power Rangers, where after a certain season that we might talk about not too far from now, which felt like a major progression of season 1 and 2, this feels like a step backwards from that season, kind of taking away a lot of the serialization of the season, going back to these individual filler episodes that just focus on the monster of the day and just utilize the lot of Sentai footage, which, to be fair, I mean, again, makes sense from a production standpoint, especially considering the popularity of Power Rangers was slightly going down during this time, to where it made sense to focus a lot more on Sentai footage. But I do think it harms the season. And even then, we get like terrible episodes like There's No Business Like Snow Business, which is one of the worst multi-parters in Power Rangers history to me. And I just think this is overall like a fine season for the majority of it, one that has a couple sprinkles of pretty great moments, but one that is just simply not as good as many of the other seasons we're going to be talking about. And because of that, for me, it is here at number 18. Now, number 17, we have the season I was literally just talking about, doing a clean sweep of these earlier seasons. We got Mighty Morphin Season 3. And it sucks to have this low, as I've always personally been a defender of Mighty Morphin Season 3. I really like the first 2/3 of Mighty Morphin Season 3. If this was only the first 2/3 of the season, this would be higher on the list, probably above the next big batch of seasons we're about to be talking about. The reason it's below it, though, is because of Alien Rangers. Because again, I'm including Alien Rangers as part of Mighty Morphin Season 3. And combining them together, Mighty Morphin Alien Rangers just sucks. And it's one of my least favorite stretches of episodes in Power Rangers history. I think it's really just complete garbage. Just felt like this excuse to utilize even more Sentai footage, while also acting as this like setup to Zeo, though again, not a particularly interesting one. We're going to be focused as Rangers as kids and them going on these journeys to get the Zeo crystals. And it's like so bland to me. But again, I feel like the first 2/3 is pretty strong. Again, there's a lot of serialization to this season. It feels like a progression of seasons 1 and 2, where seasons 1 and 2 were just very focused on these Monster of the Day episodes with a couple multi-parters along the way. This is a season that felt like it mostly focused on these running storylines. I mean, we do start off slow with A Friend in Need, but then we get Ninja Quest, which Ninja Quest Part 1 is one of my favorite episodes of all time. We get Changing of the Zords. We get A Different Shade of Pink. We get the overall Cat storyline, which is, again, a bit rocky, but still solid. Master Val and the Metallic Armor is a pretty solid multi-parter. Even Hog Day Afternoon is a solid conclusion to the season. Like, I do feel like Mighty Morphin Season 3 for me is what I would have wanted for Mighty Morphin the entire time. I feel like it's a progression of seasons 1 and 2 to actually make the show pretty good at this point. But again, it is the weakness of Alien Rangers, where again, I think outside of Hog Day Afternoon, it's just a terrible stretch of episodes that does have me sadly having to leave it behind here at number 17. Now number 16, and now we're getting to a massive batch of seasons here, really just running through the rest of the Hasbro seasons in a row, where again, I have said this earlier that I do feel like it's a struggle for me to get into modern Power Rangers. I feel like at the age that I'm at, and with obviously the shows being made for kids, I'm not the target demographic, and I think it's very clear that's the case. And while there obviously are more increasing references to older seasons that are cool to see, it doesn't change the fact that for me, the show as a whole has kind of regressed and is slowly climbing back. And really this happens with most kids shows, but I do think Power Rangers is a show that kind of grew up with its audience. I think as we got out of Mighty Morphin, I think the series got a bit more complex over time. And again, we'll be talking about a lot of the seasons moving up forward, these seasons that I personally enjoyed when I was a kid. However, it obviously got to a point where a lot of the audience grew up and stopped watching Power Rangers, and through that they kind of regressed backwards, which I think is what happened with like the likes of Samurai and Megaforce. And again, it feels like we're climbing back up to that level of complexity, but aren't necessarily quite there yet, which I think adds to what makes it a bit tougher to rank these seasons higher, along with the fact that, again, I'm watching these when I'm older. I don't have the nostalgia clouding me either. So again, we're going to wrap up the Hasbro seasons here, along with the last Neo Saban season as well throughout this batch. We have, again, 5 seasons in a row. Let's start off at number 16 with surprisingly the most recent season of the show, and that is Cosmic Fury. And straight up, I do kind of struggle with what to exactly do with Cosmic Fury, where it's a season that I enjoyed. I watched it obviously very recently, all 10 episodes, binged them all in a row, and I enjoyed my time with it. However, something always just kind of felt off to me, where again, it is a strong 10 episode stretch. None of the episodes are particularly bad. I would say only episode 5 is the one that I felt like it was a little bit weaker, but all the other episodes are pretty solid episodes. Again, there's certain things I didn't particularly like. Final fight of the series, I felt like that was kind of underwhelming. I felt like certain plot threads probably didn't need to be there. And I feel like it kind of took away from developing certain other characters. Well, I feel like certain characters on this season didn't really get that much to do. But I think like my biggest complaint of this series is kind of a complaint that is kind of the opposite of what I typically complain about, and that is the fact that I feel like the series is really rushed. And again, typically I'm complaining about, okay, this thing's too slow paced, this is boring. Cosmic Fury is the opposite. Cosmic Fury has so much going on and so much being rushed together that it has less of an impact because it's rushed together. However, again, I still stand by the fact that I would rather have something that's rushed than something that is bloated. And I still stand by that. I think Cosmic Fury is still better off being rushed here than being bloated, than being like a 40 episode season. But I do think it could have been a 20 episode season. And I think that probably would have made it better for me, because in its current state, again, like it's literally just over 3 hours of actual runtime. It very much just feels like a Power Rangers movie, more so than an actual series. And again, I just feel like things like kind of just come out of nowhere. I mean, we jump it right at the beginning where we're in the middle of this big fight with the Rangers, and just Billy is there, I guess, and he joins them as a mentor. We have Javi losing his arm, I guess that's a thing. I don't think they spend enough time really focusing on the ramifications of that. I don't love how they conclude the Zed conflict. I felt like that was a bit underwhelming. I don't know if I needed the Zordon reference. And I'll say that, like, throughout watching this, I was a bit worried they were going to just full out bring back Zordon, or even make Zato Zordon, which would have been a massive retcon. But thankfully, they didn't go with that route. But still, I mean, I feel like Cosmic Fury was fine. I feel like it's a series that I enjoyed watching. Obviously, this opinion might change over time. I might get higher on it over time. But I think as of right now, my big struggle with it is the fact that I do feel like it was extremely rushed. I feel like a lot of it was just kind of underdeveloped. To where, while the cast is mostly likable, I feel like the majority of them are given better stuff to do here. I do think having Ollie as a villain for a lot of the series was kind of interesting. I did like having Fern end up becoming a ranger. I like the ending of Zato's story and him becoming a morphing master. I obviously liked Amelia being the Red Ranger, no leader. I think all that stuff is pretty cool. And again, there were some good references along the way, and we got the reappearance of the likes of Mick and Heckle. And again, obviously we got the Megazord thing at the end. And again, there's like some cool references along the way, but as a whole, I do feel like the season was just kind of lacking in something throughout all of it that makes me struggle like looking at it as like a full-on Power Ranger season, even though it is, again, technically a season of its own. It is technically season 3 of Dino Fury, but it's just a bit of a strange season to assess, and because of that, for me, I did struggle where to land it, but I did end up going with 16 here. Now for number 15, and again, this is the last Neo Saban season left on the board, we do have Power Rangers Dino Charge. And this is a season that, again, I very much enjoyed when I originally watched it. I mean, this was a season that, again, came out of Samurai and Megaforce, 2 of the worst seasons of all time. And for us to go from that to Dino Charge, an actual competent season, was a bit of a surprise. Again, I was happy that we actually got a good season of Power Rangers for once. When they, again, had a good cast, when they had an interesting story with some interesting revelations to be revealed later on. We had actual writing instead of just copying directly from the Sentai, or not even bothering trying to write a story at all. Again, like, I think there's a lot of good here. I think it's a solid season of Power Rangers. It is a very consistent one in my mind. Again, I don't love what they did with season 2, but I do think season 1 as a whole is just pretty good. I don't think there's a single like terrible episode of the bunch. Mind you, I don't think there's like an all-time great episode in the bunch either, which is kind of where we're kind of at on this season ranking, are these like consistently good, solid seasons without a season without many flaws, but one that I don't really prop up too much. But yeah, I really feel like most of this cast came off pretty strong here, particularly Shelby. I really liked as a Ranger. I think Tyler's a fine Red Ranger. Coda's an obviously notable character. Sledge, I think, is a fine villain. So again, I just think this is a consistently solid season with a pretty decent cast, a decent villain, and really just not much truly negative to say about it. So because that, for me, it's here number 15. Now, number 14, again, continuing on with recent seasons. Here we're going on to a season that I'm pretty sure the common opinion is inverse on which of the two seasons of this show are better. But at number 14, I'm going to go Power Rangers Beast Morphers Season 1. And I really like Season 1. I think Beast Morphers is another one. I really like this cast. I think this is a solid cast. While, and are they the most developed characters in the world? Not necessarily, but I did really like Ravi's arc throughout the season. I really like Devin and Zoe. Nate has a pretty interesting storyline as well. Steel's pretty great. Again, it just feels largely in line with Dino Charge. Again, it's a very likable cast, very consistent season. I don't think there's a single terrible episode of the bunch. There's not really an episode that truly elevates beyond a pretty good, consistent season. Again, it's a good season through and through, largely in line with Dino Charge, but definitely a season that felt like a step in the right direction with the new direction of Hasbro. And also an interesting direction because, again, like this obviously used Go Buster footage, which was at least years before Beast Morphers came out, which Go Busters is one of my favorite Sentai series. Again, it was really cool to see that as well. But overall, again, I do think there's good ideas here, particularly in the fact that you have these like evil clones and Blaze and Roxy. And I think there's some good stuff here, but I feel like the other season does it a little bit better for my personal taste. And because that season 1 is here at number 14. And at number 13, who would have guessed it? We have Beast Morphers Season 2. And I'm straight up, Seasons 1 and 2 are pretty much the same. I think they're pretty much the same season. Quality-wise, again, they're consistently good. They have the same cast that are likable in both. They both have interesting ideas. I feel like Season 2 does a bit more. And while some people would argue that Season 2 doesn't execute as well on these ideas, I feel like the fact that they at least try to do some good things is enough for me to land it higher. Again, I do like the fact that we get the team-up episode. And while it isn't executed properly, I do feel like at least that's something to note from it. I feel like the filler on this season is a lot less egregious. Well, there's like one particular episode, the episode with the dance number and everything, which I see some people like. I personally didn't. I think outside of that, it's just a consistently good season. I think there's probably like more episodes that feel a bit more serialized to me, episodes that feel more important than Beast Morphers 1, where again, like I think Beast Morphers 1 does a very good job at introducing its cast and has a lot of solid episodes, but I think Beast Morphers 2 just feels like more is going on here. And we obviously get the return of Goldar, and we get the usage of Kyoryuger versus Go Buster footage, which is funny, but again, like, it's cool to see Jason back here. Again, I think that stretch of episodes is pretty fun to watch, even though, again, like, there's definitely nitpicks to be had of how it was overall made, but also, I love what they did with the connections to RPM. I love the inclusion of Venjix at the end and that reveal, the fact that it's a follow-up on the ending of RPM. I love the fact they brought back Dr. K and have her in a decent role in the end of the season. Like, I do really appreciate that stuff. To where, again, I mentioned before, like with something like Super Mega Force, fan service for the sake of fan service is simply just not good. Like, it's simply there just to sucker in old fans and not really do anything of substance with it. I feel like they did something of substance here. I do like them bringing in Dr. K and using her to parallel her to Nate. I do like the return of Venjix to kind of pay off that cliffhanger from the end of RPM. And while at the end of the day, I don't think they did it great. I mean, I think at the end of the day, I would have liked Venjix to be a bit more interesting through this, where really outside of him revealing that he's Venjix, he just kind of just acts the same as he was as Evox the entire rest of the time. But again, like, I do think there's good stuff here for sure. And I do like the references being made there. I do like the crossover episode. I think there's simply just more to note than season 1. And because I have a higher here, number 13. Now, number 12, we're moving on to, again, the last Hasbro season we have to talk about. And here we do have Dino Fury Season 2. And straight up, if this was a purely unbiased list, if I was purely going off of what I think is the quality of the season without my own personal attachment to it, this would probably be higher. I think this would probably be in the top 10. But again, I am rating this on my personal attachment to the season, which is not that much at all, considering I just watched the season not too long ago. And it's a season that I thought was good. Again, I think this is the best Hasbro season by a good chunk. I I think it is a step above the likes of Beast Morphers by quite a bit, in the fact that I think there actually are these like really interesting storylines that really come to head in this season. The fact that we have the reveal of Amelia's background and all the stuff revolving around the Void Knight and the Void Queen. Like, I thought all that content was fantastic. I think the arc of Zato is pretty solid. I like the Izzy Fran relationship here. The fact that we finally get LGBT representation in Power Rangers is nice. And there's also just a lot. I think the finale of this season is probably one of the better finales in recent Power Rangers history. We also get the return of Zed, who again technically was in season 1, but I do feel like he does a bit more in season 2. I feel like he's handled better in season 2. Like, really, I feel like season 2 is pretty much as good as you can get for a modern Power Ranger season for me. A season that I don't have any connection to, a season that still has the essence of Power Rangers, but still is able to tell a pretty solid story throughout. Now, again, there's still issues here and there. Some of the writing's still pretty bad. Some of the acting can be questionable. Like, it's still a very cheesy show, and I do feel like there are certain other seasons that we'll talk about later on the list I do think just are straight up better even without my personal attachment to it. But I think considering a lot of the limitations that are on the show currently, I think this is as good of a season as you can expect it to be. I think it's a pretty great season of the show, but one that again is still just a modern season of the show, which again I don't have as much of attachment to, because that for me it's here number 12. Now number 11, and now we're getting to the seasons that I do have more of an attachment for. I mean, these are seasons that obviously I've watched either when I was a kid or at least when I was a bit younger, where all these are pre-Neo Saban seasons. We're going to be starting it off with a season that gets a very mixed reception from the overall fan base, and it's one that I personally enjoy. I mean, I do think, like, when actually assessing this season, is it actually better than the last few we talked about? Probably not, but the season I have more of an attachment to in that season is Power Rangers Turbo. And again, I understand the criticism for Turbo. Turbo is not a perfect season by any means. The first half of the season in particular is particularly weak. I do think the first half of the season is one that, again, you have the inclusion of Justin as a character, which I don't particularly love. I don't particularly dislike him, especially as the season goes on, but I didn't like him at the very beginning. You also have the continuation of the Rangers from Zeo and them not really getting that much to do on this season, where despite them graduating from high school at the very beginning, you would think that would lead to a lot of life changes and a lot of focus on these life changes that would cause that to be a major focus of the show, but it simply isn't. And I think writing them off of the show was done pretty sloppily. However, I think once the new crew comes in, I think the season's pretty great. I really love the second half of the season. Like, I've always loved TJ as the Red Ranger, and I always like the crew of Carlos, Cassie, and Ashley, and I really just love a lot of the multi-parters we get in the back half of the season. I mean, the entire arc around the Phantom Ranger and General Havoc, I think, is a great storyline. The Clash of the Megazords is one of my favorite episodes in the show's history. Also, in the filler throughout this season, it's pretty stupid. I still really enjoyed getting to know a lot of this new crew here. You have Parts and Parcel, which is a really strong Bulk and Skull episode. And it all culminates in one of my favorite episodes in the show's history, in Chasing the Space, which is just such an incredible finale. One that really sets up these stakes for Power Rangers in space, which is obviously going to be much higher on this list. Like, and seeing the Rangers just outright lose and have the command center being destroyed is just, again, fantastic to me. Now, I do have questions of the fact that it's Diva Talks of all people that's doing this, but overall, I really like the back half of Turbo. I do think the first half is very rocky, which is why I don't have this alongside some of my all-time favorites, because I do think if it wasn't for its very rocky start, I mean, this would probably be nearing my top 5 of the list. But because of how rocky the very beginning of the season is, I can't really justify putting it much higher, but I do think it is a solid season from my point of view, and that is why it's here at number 11. Now, number 10, we're moving on to a season that I do struggle with, because this is actually another one of these seasons that is a little bit in line with my opinions on some of the better recent seasons, though a little bit less so in the fact that I watched this when I was a bit younger, but still watched this relatively late. And at number 10, I'm talking about Power Rangers Jungle Fury, which is a pretty great, consistent season of the show. One that is very strong from pretty much beginning to end. I don't think there's really a major slow point in the season. I think it is consistently good. It has a great cast. I like all of the core Rangers. I think Casey has a really strong arc. I really love RJ as their mentor. Again, I feel like there's a lot to like from this season, where I think for just objectively ranking these seasons, this definitely deserves to be higher on the list. I think this is a better season than at least 2 of the next 3 seasons we're about to be talking about. My problem with putting it higher is the fact that, again, I don't have the personal connection to this season. Again, I watched the season around the time I got back into the show, around the time of Megaforce. I really enjoyed it, and I did end up rewatching the season, still enjoying it on the rewatch. It's still simply not a season I have much connection to, because again, I did very much debate this or Turbo. However, I do think quality-wise, again, it's far above Turbo, even though I personally love a lot lot of what Turbo does. I do feel like I have enough of a connection to it through the fact that I watched it at least not very, very recently. And also, I do genuinely think it's good to where, again, I do think it should be in the top 10 here, but I do struggle putting it much higher just simply because, again, I don't have the connection I have to really most of the seasons we're about to be talking about following this. And it is that weird dichotomy for me that, again, despite me thinking this is a strong season, I am leaving it a little bit behind here, number 10. Now, number 9, we're moving on to a season that, again, I think objectively is worse than Jungle Fury. I think this is a kind of mixed bag of a season. Now, I think there are more positives than negatives, and I do think it is a better season than Turbo in particular, but still a very rocky season. At number 9, we do have Power Rangers Wild Force. And I like Wild Force is one of these seasons that, again, I adored when I was a kid. And this is probably around my peak in Power Rangers fandom when I was a kid. I'm this point where, again, the last 3 seasons of the show are, again, still seasons that we haven't talked about and will be pretty high on this list. But I feel like Wild Force is the weakest of those. I do feel like Wild Force, and while Wild Force definitely has its high moments, and I love the show at the time, I do think looking back on it, it definitely has its weak points. I think its environmental message is very one note and really just over top in its portrayal, and that's something that kind of bothers me on the rewatch of the season. I also feel like it feels like a bit of a downgrade from a lot of the more recent seasons of the show in terms of character development, where it does feel like this is a season that is so focused on Cole that the other characters really don't get that much to do outside of maybe Taylor. Now, for the most part, I do think Cole is a likable character. I do think he ends up having a pretty interesting background. I think the entire arc of Master Org is pretty strong. But again, I do think the thematic messaging of this season is kind of poorly done. Now, outside that, obviously, we do get some all-time great episodes here. I mean, we get Forever Red, which, again, I've done an individual video on that was longer than the episode itself, so you can tell how much I love that episode. I love Reinforcements from the Future. Incredible team-up episode as well. I think the arc of Zenaku, for the most part, is pretty solid. I think you have Master's Last Stand, which is a pretty solid episode as well. The finale, for the most part, is pretty good. I mean, I don't love the overall outcome to the story, but I do love seeing the Rangers fail in part 1, which has always been something that I personally love, to seeing the Rangers lose everything in the finales. But again, I feel like this season to me is just a bit inconsistent. I think the overall storytelling is a bit wonky. I think it's a very Cole-centric season. I think it's also a very Sentai-heavy season, one that does a lot of one-for-one copying of the Sentai, and I think for me, the issue is that the Sentai isn't that great. Where really, for me, the high points of the season are the points where it doesn't do what the Sentai did. Again, Forever Red, Reinforcements from the Future, Master's Last Stand, all original content. And I feel like the stuff that isn't original is just kind of blah. Look, and that's my issue this season. I still think it's a really enjoyable one. Obviously, a season I have a lot of nostalgia for, and because that is here at number 9. Now, number 8, we're moving on to a season that's probably lower for me than most people. I know a lot of people love this season. This is a lot of people's top few seasons. And again, it's still a good season for me. It's still, again, number 8 on this list out of 30. At number 8, I'm going to leave off Power Rangers Dino Thunder. And Dino Thunder is a season for me that I never just gelled with as much. Like, I generally did not like this season when it aired. I remember when it was airing that I just really could not find myself connected to this season. I found a lot of the events of the season just kind of boring. Now, rewatching it, I was wrong. Straight up, I was wrong. I think it is a good season. It is a very good season. It is one that, while yes, I do think the likes of Connor and Ethan are a bit over the top in their portrayals, and there certainly are stretches in the season that I think are not as good as others. I do think for the most part, this is a strong season. Again, I do like the return of Tommy. I mean, while it wasn't like 100% necessary for the season in my mind, I do feel like it does add to the season, and particularly with this being a Dino themed season, and obviously them trying to add in these parallels, the Mighty Morphin along the way. Like, I think it does make sense that Tommy is here. I also think the White Ranger arc is pretty good as well. You got a pretty strong team up episode this season where Thunderstorm has always been one of my personal favorite episodes. You have episodes like The Passion of Connor. It's pretty solid Battleizer introduction episode. It's obviously focused around Connor. You got Fighting Spirit, obviously the episode where Tommy fights against his inner demons, aka his old Ranger forms. And again, that's pretty cool. Yeah, I do think there is a lot to like about Dino Thunder, and 100% I was wrong as a kid for not liking this season, but I still don't love this season as much as I love other seasons. Again, I do think it is because of that lack of connection to it when I was a kid that makes me not put this higher on the list, because again, I do think objectively, is this a top 5 season? Probably. I think when like solely assessing it on its quality, I think it is a really top tier season. Again, it does have a really great villain, one of the best villains in Power Rangers history. It has, again, a solid cast. It has a lot of really great overarching storylines. It has, again, a great crossover. Again, it has a lot going for it. But I do think my personal detachment from it, particularly at the time that aired, is what leaves it a bit behind here at number 8. Now, number 7. And this is a season that I think straight up is not as good as Dino Thunder. I do think it is a season that does have many holes in its overall run, but it's a season that I personally loved at the time, more so than Dino Thunder, so I'm putting it a bit higher. At number 7, I do have Ninja Storm. And obviously Ninja Storm was the first full Disney production for Power Rangers, the first season after they moved to New Zealand, and through that it does feel very unique. And through that there's also a lot of growing pains. I mean, there's a lot of weird things with this season, particularly in terms of some bizarre sound issues. You have some weird decisions like making a ridiculous number of multi-parters, even though some of those parts don't have anything or very little to do with the other parts. You also have this like weird aspect of the season where they tried to like make it seem like a reboot by like making it seem like it's not in the same world as previous seasons, only to then retcon that. And again, there's a lot of weird stuff going on in this season, but I really loved it at the time. Like, I really love the majority of this cast. I loved Shane at the time. Obviously the context of his actor and what happened with him makes it strange to think of Shane as a character nowadays, but again, at the time I really loved Shane's character. I really like Tori. I like Dustin. Blake and Hunter are fine, but I really love Cam as well. Cam was probably my favorite character at the time. I really love this team. Lothor, I'm a bit mixed on as a villain. I can understand the criticisms with him being too comedic, and I fully get that. I don't personally hate him, though, particularly in the fact that I do think he is particularly threatening when he does actually do things, instead of just sitting back and being upset at his minions for not being able to do anything of substance. But again, this season does have a decent amount of overarching storylines. There are a ridiculous number of multi-parters in this season. Again, while like some of those don't really feel like they're really still part of the same season, with something like Samurai's Journey Part 3 being part of that in particular, I think this season still has some really notable storylines. I mean, the entire Thunder Ranger arc is really notable to me, and having these two evil Rangers show up from almost the very beginning and overpowering the Rangers is a really interesting dynamic to show. Now, I will say I do kind of criticize the fact that it doesn't really allow for this establishment of the status quo early on, but I do overall enjoy their arc. I really love the arc of Cam. I think later on there's some pretty decent episodes like Shane's Karma, where he gets his battleizer. You have General Deception, which is a pretty strong episode. You get Samurai's Journeys Parts 1 and 2 are both really strong. I just really feel like there's a lot of strong stuff with this season. Again, I do think as a whole, it is worse technically than Dino Thunder, but again, I have more of a personal attachment to this season. So again, I'm putting it higher at number 7. Now number 6. And at number 6, I have probably the season that I have the most conflicted opinions about, where this is a season that I think is on paper great. I think this is probably debatably the best Power Ranger season ever made. However, it's also a season that, one, again, I don't have as much attachment to. Again, this is a season I watched much later on, but even beyond that, a season that I find tough to really even look at as a proper Power Ranger season, and that is Power Rangers RPM, which again is great. I mean, this is a really solid Power Ranger season, one that is extremely meta in the fact that we constantly get these self-referential jokes, and one that, again, it feels like this big dichotomy from Power Rangers, and the fact that it's taking place in this like post-apocalypse that very much takes trends from the likes of Mad Max and Terminator and utilizes that to tell a very unique story within the Power Rangers universe, at least at first. And again, it's a very interesting way to tell a Power Ranger season, one that does utilize flashback episodes to tell character backstories. And while I do feel like certain characters like Summer and Flynn kind of fall to the wayside after those flashback episodes, I still think there are good moments for them in those episodes. I mean, the overall acting of the season is pretty strong, and the writing is pretty strong. But I think my qualms with this season come from a couple of things. I think one, the back half of the season kind of regresses into it falling more into the Power Ranger formula, where after Judd Lin takes over, you can very much tell they just transition everything into essentially just doing a redo of Power Rangers in space with the Dylan and Tanaya relationship. And also, I feel like its attempt to tell a story in line with that of like a Mad Max, and they're kind of showing more of its flaws as a show for me, where again, I think it is a good show for a kid's show. I think when it utilizes these concepts in a kid's show, it just reminds you that, oh, this is just a like worse version. And especially considering like it's Sentai footage is a bit of a mess as well. I don't know. It's a bit of a mixed bag for me. I still really like the season, obviously. It's still number 6 here. I think it is technically the best Power Rangers season ever made in terms of the overall quality of how it's written, the overall quality of how it tells this like really unique story for the Power Rangers world. I think the character of Dr. K is one of the best in Power Rangers history, and her backstory episode in particular is one of the best episodes in Power Rangers history. But I just feel like as a Power Rangers season, it doesn't feel as much like Power Rangers. It feels like the Power Rangers themselves are kind of an afterthought on this season. And instead, what is more of the focus are these more post-apocalyptic trends. And it's a really good season. It's just one that I do lack as much of a connection to and also struggle with its connection to the rest of the series, which is why I do have it here at number 6. Now, number 5, we have a season that straight up, this was actually much lower on the list when I made my initial draft of this list. And I do think straight up, this is not as good of a season as really the last few we talked about. It's probably a season that like technically is on par with that of something like a Ninja Storm, but I have more nostalgia for this season, so screw it. At number 5, I'm putting Lightspeed Rescue, and again, like Lightspeed Rescue, I think is a good season. It is a very strong season. It's a season that is also a pretty unique season for this point in Power Rangers history, where up to this point, Rangers have always been this like kind of separate entity that was fighting for the likes of Zordon or kind of just do-goods doing stuff on their own. Here, we're finally having the Power Rangers be this like government entity, and I feel like that leads to some intrigue on this season. Definitely a different tone for this season. Though I will say, I do think there are definitely qualms to have with this season, particularly in fact that the villains, for the most part, are pretty mundane. I don't feel like any of them are that interesting. Even Diabolico, who does have a little bit of an interesting arc, is still, like, again, not the most riveting character in the world. The Rangers themselves are also not the greatest in the world. I mean, I really like Ryan in particular. I really like Carter, even though he doesn't get that much development. But really, the other characters are just kind of fine. I mean, Joel does get a lot of content, so at least there's that. But again, it's not the most riveting season from a pure character standpoint, but I do love a lot of this season. I mean, to me, the Titanium Ranger arc is probably still one of my favorite arcs in Power Rangers history. I absolutely adore almost everything that is done with that arc, from the point where the Titanium Ranger is introduced, to the point where you find out he's Ryan and Ryan's backstory, to the point where they convince Ryan to join the team, only for him to have the Cobra that could potentially kill him. And for all this to lead up to the eventual first defeat of Diabolico, I think is incredible. I love that entire 8-episode stretch of the season. Now, I will say there's also some pretty bad filler episodes. I mean, again, Dana gets a bad episode of her just out of character, wanting to be an actress. You get like Chad and the mermaid. And again, there's some bad episodes as well, but I love that stretch at the beginning. And I really love the stretch at the end, where the last 4 episodes are also incredible, where you have this first face-off with Queen Ben-Shira, then you have Rises of Super Demons with this really epic Megazord fight, and then you get Fated Lightspeed, which is one of my favorite finales in Power Rangers history. I mean, just the fact that the entire Aqua Base is destroyed by the Life Force Megazord, and we have the Rangers having to find their way out, and even then, once they do, they have to destroy the Omega Megazord and take on Ben-Shira themselves. Again, all that's just an incredible finale with such a grim tone throughout a lot of it. I really love a lot of what Lightspeed Rescue does. I think when Lightspeed Rescue is good, it is great. The problem is that when it's bad, it's really bad. But again, for me personally, I just have such a connection to the season. It's one of my favorite seasons from when I was a kid. It's really the first season I watched entirely live as a kid. And because of that, I absolutely adore this season. And for me, it's here number 5. Now number 4, and really for me, the top 3 are definitive. I think the top 3 were always going to be my top 3. I've looked those 3 seasons as my 3 best seasons since I was a kid, and it's stuck to this day. But at number 4, I do have Power Rangers SPD. And SPD is very good in its own right. I mean, to me, SPD is easily the best of the Disney era seasons. I think it is a season that has an incredible cast. I think its cast is one of the best in the show's history. Again, I think Jack is one of the best Red Rangers. I think Blue is one of the best Blue Rangers. I think Bridge is a really fun Green Ranger. I think Z is a really great Yellow Ranger. And I think Sid's kind of an okay Pink Ranger, but again, it's fine. Doggy Kruger is probably one of my favorite mentors in the show's history. I think other side characters like Cat and Boom are solid. I think it is an incredible cast. I think Grum is a solid villain, not the greatest in the world, but I think gets a little bit more depth than many other Power Ranger villains. And I think it's also just a really consistent season. I think this is a season that really lacks a bad episode. I think really almost every episode is solid, and there's almost no episodes that don't lead to anything. It feels like a season that is pretty serialized, where even in the filler episodes, there's at least like something within it that does play into a following episode. I think there's a lot really great with SPD. I really like the cast. I think the arc of Sky in particular is one of the best in Power Rangers history. I think Jack is also really, really strong. And while this season I don't think hits the high highs of the next 3 seasons, I think it's probably a more consistent season than at least 2 of the next 3. So I think there's a serious argument for this being one of the better seasons in the show's history. And again, for me, I really do love it as well. And that's why it's here at number 4. Now we're at the top 3. And again, these are my personal top 3. Have been since I was a kid. I adored these 3 seasons when I was a kid, and I still adore them now. And really, the order for me is pretty arbitrary. I think I love all 3 of these for different reasons. I think these all have a different specific high point in Power Rangers history for me. But the order I'm personally going to go with is that at number 3, I do have Power Rangers In Space. And again, In Space is incredible. I adore this season. I think this being the culmination of the Zordon era, and for us to constantly call back to previous seasons, I think is incredible. I do love how they culminate this season, and the destruction of Zordon to eliminate all the evil in the world, which again, while a bit cheesy in that aspect, I do really love what they do with it there, even though again, it makes no sense for future seasons, but again, it's fine because they thought this was going to be last season. But beyond that, again, we get the continuation of the cast from Turbo, just swapping out Justin for Andro, so I think it's a much better character here, one of the better Red Rangers in the show's history. I just think we get some of the best episodes in the show's history on this season. I mean, we get a great intro to the season from out of nowhere as a great introduction to the overall premise of the show. We get the Delta Discovery and the reintroduction of Phantom Ranger, and that's pretty cool. We get the Darkonda arc and the eventual reveal of the Mega Voyager, which is fantastic. We get a crossover episode with Justin from Turbo, and that's a pretty good episode as well. Along with the fact that we also get a crossover of Adam, which is a great episode for Carlos's arc. We obviously have the Psycho Ranger arc, which is one of my favorites in Power Rangers history, to where, well, there are like a couple slower beats in that stretch. Like, I really do love a lot of what they do with the Psycho Rangers. And while, to fair, a lot of that is from the Sentai, the final battle with the Psycho Rangers is one of my favorite Megazord fights in Power Rangers history. And you have the Endgame stretch, which is just incredible. I mean, the return of the Psycho Rangers at Secret City is really great, along with the inclusion of the first ever Battleizer. We get the slow destruction of the Megazords from episode to episode, with Ecliptor destroying the Delta Megazord and them having to sacrifice the Mega Voyager. And then we obviously get the incredible conclusion to the season and Countdown to Destruction, which is still 2 of the best episodes in Power Rangers history. This great culmination to the series up to that point. And again, I love Power Rangers in Space. Now, the reason it's not higher is because I do think it probably has lower lows for me than my next 2 seasons. I think there are some filler episodes that are not particularly great, especially earlier on in the season. I mean, Grandma Matchmaker to this day is one of the worst episodes in the show's history. Even the Psycho Ranger arc does have like a random episode in the middle, which is like Carlos filler episode, which is not great. I think it is a bit more of an inconsistent season for me personally. I know there's a future season that we'll talk about that more people look at as a bit more inconsistent, but again, we'll talk about it. Again, I really love In Space. I think it's still a great season. It's just the minor nicks there that leave it out of the top 2, which is why it's here number 3. Now, number 2 season of all time for Power Rangers, for me, ends up being Power Rangers Time Force. And I adore Time Force. Time Force is a season I adored as a kid. I remember watching this every week and just being riveted at what was happening. I love the overall storyline this season. I love Wes and Jen as characters. I remember really rooting for them to get together through this season. I love Eric as a character, who's always been a personal favorite of mine. I really like Trip and Katie. Lucas is there. Rancic is a great villain, even though I think in retrospect, maybe a little bit wonky thematically, but again, still pretty great villain. Even Frax is a solid villain. I love Wes's individual arc on the season and his storyline with his father. I love the overall themes of defying destiny. And again, there's a lot to love with Time Force. I think Time Force is arguably the best season of the show. I think when looking at the consistency of the show, I think maybe outside of like the Clock Tower episode, which I never particularly love, I think it is a great season. I think it is one that is consistent for most of its run. I think it does have a wide range of really strong episodes. I mean, the premiere alone with the death of Alex and the Rangers going back in time and then meeting Wes and Wes having to prove himself to be part of the team, all that is fantastic. The entire Quantum Ranger arc is one of my favorite arcs in Power Rangers history. You also have some great episodes like The Time Shadow, Future Unknown. Trust and Triumph has always been one of my favorite filler episodes, which is great testing of Wes and Jen's trust in each other. Always loved Quantum Secrets, as this episode focused on Eric. I thought Movie Madness was a fun episode, even though, again, it's a filler episode for sure, but I think it's just a fun all-around two-parter there. Again, the overall arc around Frax towards the end game is really strong. And I really just love the finale once again of End of Time. Again, an incredible conclusion to this season. I don't love the final part as much, if I'm being honest. I do think the first two parts are fantastic. This downfall for the Rangers and Wes sending the others back to the future, and Wes and Eric having to do the fight on their own is a really great sequence. Now again, the final part, I do love the beginning of it, of the other Rangers coming and saving Wes. Though you think the handling of Rancic surrendering is a little bit cheesy, and again, still disappointing that we don't get Wes and Jen kissing at the end. And even though, again, that scene really broke my heart when I was a kid, though, which again, like, still, it's a great finale. It's a great season. Again, I think this is an incredible season through and through. I think it's technically probably one of the better seasons of the show. I think if I were to do this purely based on my opinion of the quality of the season, this would probably be number one. But again, my personal attachment to the number one season still definitely surpasses this. So that is why I do have Time Force at number two. Now, number one, my favorite season of Power Rangers in the history of the show is Power Rangers Lost Galaxy. And as I mentioned this at the beginning of the video, this was my first season. This is the season I watched when I was a kid that got me into the show. And I still adore this season. I still go back and watch certain episodes from the seasons at points. I do really adore the show, but I understand why others don't. And I understand why it is not the best season, because it isn't. Fundamentally, it isn't. It is a very flawed season. And there are certainly stretches in the season that are not particularly great. I think the episodes after they get the Galacta Beast to the point where we start the Magna Defender arc is not particularly great. Like, beyond that, there's a few filler episodes here and there that are not great. A Red Romance is probably one of the worst episodes in Power Rangers history in my mind. The Lost Galaxy arc is underwhelming for sure. I mean, while I think there are still great episodes within that, I still think, yeah, there are some mediocre episodes there. However, I still love this season. I get, yes, there are flaws. There are slow points this season. There are certain writing issues. There are definitely some conceptual issues, but I just love how much of a risk they took with this season. And looking at the Sentai for this season, it being an entirely Earth-based season, the fact that they turned that into this space opera of the Rangers essentially living on this spaceship that's searching for a new home for humanity is, again, just such an undertaking. Which, again, I just have so much respect for the fact that they even tried to make this series. And again, I think for the most part, it turns out pretty well. I think there are some great episodes in this season. I think the opener is very strong. And the second half of part two is not as great, but yeah, I love us getting introduced to each of the characters and us getting this like very different aesthetic from what we expect for Power Rangers as we prepare for Terra Venture to set off. We again get the Magna Defender arc, which I think is incredible. I love this stretch of episodes. I used to watch this stretch of episodes over and over again. I literally to this day still have the VHS tape that includes this arc on it, and I used to watch as a kid over and over again. And I love the following episode as well. After Mike returns, we get Destined for Greatness, this great character piece for Leo and his struggles with him not feeling worthy of the Red Ranger power. And we then get the rescue mission, this super unique episode. Essentially just feels like an Alien ripoff. And while again, it's not 100% my sort of thing, I still think it's a very unique thing for Power Rangers to attempt. We then get the Lost Galacta Beast two-parter, which is a fantastic two-part episode there. We get Heir to the Throne, where we get the defeat of Scorpius, and through that makes Trakina the main antagonist of the series, which I think is great. Also, Deviant as an antagonist is really fun as well. We get one of my favorite filler episodes in the Chameleon Warrior, which I think is a really fun one. And then we obviously got to talk about the crossover, which is still debatably the best crossover in Power Rangers history. I mean, To the 10th Power is this great team up between In Space and Lost Galaxy, where I take on the Psycho Rangers, and then follow that up with the Power of Pink. Again, the death of Kendrix, which is just this insane moment to see a Power Ranger die on screen. We then get Corone becoming the Pink Ranger. Again, this great payoff to her arc from the previous season. And then we get Facing the Past, this great episode of her having to deal with the guilt she feels for her actions as Astronema. And we also get Leo's Battleizer in that episode. And then we also get the Lost Galaxy arc, which again, people don't like. I personally still really like aspects of it. Obviously, it was done to essentially just save on money due to being able to use more Sentai footage, but I still really love the Megazord battles in this sequence in particular. The fights against Grunchor are pretty great. Titanosaur is a really great battle as well. And for it to all culminate in Escape from the Lost Galaxy, where Mike ends up sacrificing his powers for them to escape, is again still also a really great episode. And it all ends with Journey's End, which is debatably my favorite episode in Power Rangers history. That incredible 3-part finale to the season that has again destruction of Terra Venture. You have destruction of the Astro Astro Mega ship. You get the destruction of most of the Megazords. And again, it is this incredible, dark episode of the Rangers losing everything for most of it. Now, I will say I don't love part 3, which kind of seems to be a trend of Power Rangers, where I don't know if they always stick the landing. But hey, I don't love that Kendrix gets brought back to life out of nowhere. I don't know if I love that they just like randomly landed on Miranoi, which seems very convenient. But I love the final battle of Trakina. I love this like near sacrifice that Leo does to take her down, which is just this incredible moment. I really do love A Lot of Lost Galaxy. I mean, Leo is still one of my favorite characters in Power Rangers history. I love Mike as well. I think Kai is a really strong character. I like Damon. I like Kendrix. I like Maya. I like most of this cast. I do think there are really cool like Star Trek sort of vibes with this season as well. And again, there's some really great story arcs along the way as well. So again, I really adore this season. It's also a season that got me into Power Rangers, which is also a major factor, obviously, in it being this high. Where objectively, again, I don't think it's as good as Time Force. I think it's probably not as good as In Space. I think it's probably a bit closer to the likes of SPD and Lightspeed Rescue and Ninja Storm and those sort of seasons, but I still adore this season, and I have a lot of a personal connection to it, so that is the reason why I have it here at number 1. But there we go. I mean, that is my season ranking for Power Rangers, a video I've been wanting to do for so long now. Another one taken off the bucket list, and really kind of the last one where, again, like coming into making this channel, there's like this big list of rankings I wanted to do. I mean, obviously got the reality TV ones out of the way pretty quickly, but I did the Assassin's Creed ranking, I did the Sasuke ranking, and now I've done the Power Ranger ranking. I mean, I've done a lot of these major rankings I've been wanting to do, even the ones outside the reality TV realm, so and that's cool. Now moving forward, will I do more Power Ranger videos? Don't know. I'd like to do a Red Ranger ranking at some point. I still think that would be fun. I'll obviously still do the retrospectives, but again, outside that, not really sure how much Power Ranger content there'll really be. But again, this is a video that has been a long time coming, and I'm happy to finally get it out. I mean, there we go. I mean, that is my ranking of every Power Ranger season. Thank you for watching.